Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Moin Rabbani. Hello, Moin. Thank you for joining us again.
Good to be with you as always, Nassim. Thank you for having me.
This week, we will begin with the dramatic development at the ICC, who have applied to issue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders and a number of Palestinian leaders as well. And then we will discuss the crash which has led to the death of President Ebrahim Raisi of Iran, fallout from that domestically and also internationally. What kind of implication does that have? And then we'll return to developments within Israel itself. Benny Gantz threatening Netanyahu with withdrawal from the government if there is no Gaza post-war plan. It seems like there's a huge disagreement within Israel itself, not to mention within Washington as well. And then we'll end with a conversation about the recent trip by the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who visited both Saudi Arabia and Israel. And we'll share some of the developments from that. And I'll ask Moin for his view on this recent trip by Jake Sullivan. But let's begin, Moin, with the most dramatic news that was that we received this morning. The ICC, International Criminal Court, finally making application for arrest warrants today against Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, and a number of Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Diab, who is the commander-in-chief of Al-Qassam Brigade, and Ismail Haniya. So speak to the main charges that are leveled against Israel. And is this a game changer, as some have described it?
Well, I think it's very significant, and I think it's a game changer in the sense that, unlike the International Court of Justice that adjudicates disputes between states, the International Criminal Court deals with individual criminal responsibility. And therefore, these arrest warrants are being issued against specific individuals and specific leaders who state parties to the International Criminal Court are now under an obligation to extradite to the Netherlands so that they can properly be put on trial in The Hague. I have to say, this is not a development I expected. Karim Khan has become a past master at dragging his feet when it comes to the ICC's investigation of the situation in Palestine. But today he did issue 5 arrest warrants, or more precisely, he is now presenting the case for arrest warrants to what's called a pretrial chamber, composed of 3 judges who will decide whether indeed there are reasonable grounds to authorize him to issue those warrants. And I think most legal specialists point out that it would require extremely unusual circumstances for the pre-trial chamber to deny those warrants. I'd like to make several observations about what happened today. This case originated in 2015 when the state of Palestine ratified the Rome Statute and sought to join the International Criminal Court as a state party. It took many years for the state of Palestine to become an ICC member state, and for the ICC to determine that it has jurisdiction to investigate. But the investigation has been ongoing since, I believe, 2019. And the investigation has been looking into all crimes committed by any party on the territory of the state of Palestine, or by any Palestinian in the state of Palestine committed on the territory of Israel. So what struck me first of all is that for Karim Khan, history also began on October 7th, 2023, despite an investigation that formally has been going on for years, his indictments today did not deal with any crimes committed prior to the 7th of October 2023. They did not deal with the question of apartheid, which is considered a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. It did not deal with the war crime of illegal settlement practices in the occupied territory. It did not deal with crimes committed during Israel's 2014 onslaught on the Gaza Strip, or the Great March of Return in 2018, or the more recent conflict in 2021, which gives a clear impression that Khan was only spurred into action by the Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October of last year. Secondly, my own suspicion was that he would issue a number of arrest warrants against Palestinian leaders, and then for the purpose of balance, try to indict a few settlers or Israeli extremists. But what he in fact did is he's seeking arrest warrants for 3 prominent Palestinian leaders, but 2 Israeli leaders. And this begs the question that when you look at the charge sheet against Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, why wasn't the exact same charge sheet applied to the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, given that on the Palestinian side of the equation, an arrest warrant is being sought for Ismail Haniyeh, the titular head of the Hamas movement, who, according to the available reports, was not involved in the planning and execution of the October 7th attack. More importantly, why was an arrest warrant not issued against the Israeli chief of the general staff, who has been pivotal in all these crimes being noted by the ICC prosecutor? What about all the division commanders? Why was the charge of genocide left out? And so I think it raises a whole host of questions about the way that the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC has been operating for many years. It's foot dragging, and it's going out of its way to not only seek to give an impression of balance, but in this particular case, also placing a greater burden on Palestinians than on Israelis. Of course, it's widely reported that Palestinians did commit war crimes and atrocities on October 7th. That's not the issue here. The issue is the way in which Karim Khan has gone about it, which I think leaves quite a lot to be desired. I think another observation needs to be made is that, ironically, we have gotten to this point because of Hamas. We could not have gotten to this point without the endorsement of Hamas, because what happened is in 2015, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, was coming under increasing criticism and condemnation from his own people for his foot dragging with respect to submitting an application to the ICC to become a member of the Assembly of State Parties. And that was in response to massive Israeli and American and also European pressure. Abbas, when he was ready to finally do so, did not want to be put in a position of opening up other Palestinians, particularly those from Hamas, to criminal indictment and then having to be condemned for that as well. So he made very clear that he would only submit the Palestinian application to the ICC if that application was explicitly endorsed by Hamas. And Hamas did endorse that application. And it was only because of that Hamas endorsement that State of Palestine became an ICC member. And that made possible the developments that we've seen today. So here we have a situation where Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have been calling for a proper investigation of any and all international crimes committed on the territory of the state of Palestine, while Israel and the United States and other Western allies have consistently and categorically rejected these investigations and rejected the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over the issues we're discussing today.
Yes, I mean, there's clearly an attempt to employ both sidism on the part of Khan. And if you read the charge sheet, and it's clearly the case, and it begs the question, why start on 2023? As you mentioned, the ICC has been invited to look into Palestine and Israel since 2015, and Hamas has
14, in
been,
fact.
sorry, 2014.
Right.
Hamas has previously supported the investigation. But do you think, given now this time, three Hamas leaders have been named, they will cooperate with the ICC investigation? I mean, one would assume that that would be in their best interest. Israel clearly, so far, the signals we're getting is that Israel will not be paying any attention whatsoever, will seek to take punitive measures against the ICC. But do you think Hamas will also this time cooperate with any future ICC investigation?
Well, Hamas has denounced the arrest, the intention to issue arrest warrants for three of its leaders, and has denounced the ICC for drawing an equivalence between the oppressor and victim. But I think that's a separate issue about whether Hamas, were it in a position to do so, encourage and enable the ICC to continue its investigations of the situation in Palestine. And here we can only go by the available record, which is that since 2008, 2009, Hamas has in fact consistently permitted international investigators, whether from human rights organizations, whether from the United Nations, or from other bodies, to conduct investigations on territory it controls. This despite such organizations on repeated occasions coming to conclusions that have condemned not only Israel, but Hamas as well. So the record in that respect, I think, is fairly clear and also encouraging. As far as Israel is concerned, they've responded exactly how one would expect, throwing a tantrum, saying that actually these legal instruments exist only to defend Israel and not anyone else. And Netanyahu, of course, had to mobilize the Holocaust as a shield again in his first response. But I believe the more interesting response is going to come not from Israel, but from its chief ally and sponsor, the United States. The US government has repeatedly gone on the record denouncing this investigation, claiming that the ICC has no jurisdiction, whereas in fact it has absolute jurisdiction. But more importantly, the US has been repeatedly making very serious threats against the ICC and its personnel. You may remember that during the waning days of the Trump administration, it imposed all kinds of sanctions on Khan's predecessor, Fatou Bensouda, and others, sanctions that are normally reserved for organized crime types and terrorists. But we'll have to see what the US does now. It has already, a group of US congressmen have already publicly threatened reprisal and retaliation against the ICC, basically threatened them with financial sanctions, arrest warrants, I believe, and all kinds of consequences. And the interesting thing is that those threats and those direct efforts to impede the proper functioning to the ICC are also violations of the Rome Statute. So will Karim Khan have the backbone to now also respond to those threats by seeking arrest warrants for the criminal activity of American officials who are seeking to obstruct the work of the ICC. And of course, the other aspect now is how the United States, the United Kingdom, and other states who have basically said, who have denounced the ICC for what it's doing, how will this affect their policies? Because if you're supporting a leader who has an arrest warrant out for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and you're still sending him arms and you're still casting vetoes in the UN Security Council, well, that makes you rather complicit as well. And how will these European states who blab on about human rights and the rule of law from sunrise till sunset every day of the year and then some, how will they act if these indicted individuals visit their territory? Will they actually seek to arrest them and extradite them to The Hague? Or will they again change their legislation in order to ensure Israel has impunity in its dealings with the Palestinian people? And perhaps of particular interest, how will the recent the radical right Dutch government, which is now being formed, and whose biggest party is led by a fanatical extremist who openly espouses a point of view that Jordan is the Palestinian homeland. How will they respond if any of these Israeli criminals are arrested and extradited to the Netherlands?
Yeah, and it is worth recalling that Karim Khan was Israel's preferred candidate in
Yes.
2021, as he was the preferred candidate of the UK, the US, and everyone else, thinking that he will go soft on Israel. And he has thus far. If any other prosecutor would have moved much, much sooner than he has. So they managed to buy time with Karim Khan, despite what we see, despite the genocide in Gaza. But the implications of that is quite significant for Israeli leaders. Of course, America is not a signatory, but what that could mean potentially, I want to get your thoughts on that, is Israeli leaders not being able to travel to at least 130 or 140 countries while there is a arrest warrant hanging over their head. So potentially, Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant will not be able to travel to the UK, Germany, and many other European countries.
Yes, I mean, when is the last time that Yahya Sinwar or Ismail Haniya took took their wives on a shopping trip to Paris or London? This is going to have much more serious consequences for Israeli leaders who are used to jet setting all over the West on a constant basis than for the Hamas leaders. And as far as Ismail Haniya is concerned, yes, he resides in Qatar, but Qatar is not a party to the ICC, and therefore will presumably, like other states that are not parties, not feel compelled to fulfill any extradition requests. So I think the real issue here is now Israeli leaders and their freedom of movement, because they pop up in a different Western country every other day. So that will be very interesting. And even more interesting is the extent to which the Europeans will now change their understanding of the rule of law so that Israel can continue to enjoy impunity. We've seen it now in the US, how basically the concept of free speech and freedom of assembly and the right to protest in the US is being transformed in order to suppress discussion and debate about Israel's genocidal onslaught. And I would expect something similar. I really don't have high hopes that any of these European governments who incessantly pontificate about the rule of law and are always wagging their fingers at darker peoples, that they will take any significant measures to ensure that any arrest warrants issued by the ICC are actually consummated.
That said, it does open up the possibility of lawyers under universal jurisdiction to take on that responsibility. One would assume. Is that not the case?
I'm not sure I understood.
Oh, I mean, even if the states don't move to arrest Netanyahu, one would assume that under universal jurisdiction,
Yeah,
given that there is a arrest warrant against
I
Netanyahu,
see. Yeah.
legal bodies which are not aligned to the government, they can take measures into their own hands and try and arrest Netanyahu and Gallant. And if in the future any other Israeli leader is indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. That was
Well,
the point I'm making.
yeah,
Sorry.
well, here the precedents are not very encouraging. I mean, we had the whole case launched against Ariel Sharon in Belgium for his responsibility for the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And there, the law was basically rewritten to ensure he had immunity. Then we've had cases of Israeli officials visiting the United Kingdom who were warned by the British authorities not to disembark from their flights. And I really don't expect much to change in terms of European complicity with Israel. We have to understand Israeli impunity is sacrosanct to these countries, and Trump's any lip service they pay to the rule of law or human rights, which is basically just for show.
Talking about Israeli impunity, that was one of the key points raised last week in the ICJ, International Court of Justice, in South Africa's case against Israel, where the lawyers for South Africa argued that because of Israeli impunity or the impunity enjoyed by Israel, it has completely ignored the provisional measures that were issued in January and then subsequently, I think 3 months later, to allow humanitarian assistance. So that was an important development last week, where the South African team again went back to the ICJ, requesting further provisional measures and enforcement of previous provisional measures to stop Israel going into Rafah. So what are the key points for you from last week's development at The Hague?
Yeah, this is the fourth time that South Africa has gone to the International Court of Justice seeking provisional measures. And I think what struck me this time is they placed much more emphasis on seeking to persuade the court to actually order a comprehensive ceasefire that had been among their previous list of demands, but this time it struck me as really being front and center. And the argument that the South Africans made was basically that Rafah is kind of the let's say the final installment of Israel's plan to raise the Gaza Strip to the ground, and that if the ICJ does not act now, there will be nothing left to act upon. It was once again a very compelling presentation by the South Africans, and we'll have to see how the court responds. And on the three previous occasions, the court has declined to issue an order to Israel to cease fire on the grounds that it cannot order a comprehensive ceasefire in the Gaza Strip because Hamas is not a party to the Genocide Convention, and that any ceasefire order would therefore not be obligatory upon one party to the conflict. I suspect, given that we are now, given that where we are now, and given Israel's systematic rejection in word and deed of the existing provisional measures issued by the court, that we may well see the court do something that it has never done before in similar situations, which is to call for a comprehensive ceasefire. And it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. The other thing that made an impression on me is the weakness of the Israeli delegation. You may remember in January during the first hearing, the Israelis came with a full panoply of lawyers and legal experts and specialists and provided a very detailed presentation. This time, I believe they were represented by only three individuals whose main argument seemed to be that South Africa is Hamas. And so the extraordinary weakness of their latest presentations may well play into South Africa's hands as well, and help persuade the International Court of Justice again to do something that it has not done before in similar cases. And as one observer noted, Israel stated that it was unable to come to this session with a proper delegation because it had insufficient notice. I believe it was only 10 days. And the observer, I can't remember who, said, well, Israel considered 24 hours notice enough for 1 million people to evacuate their homes in the Gaza Strip, but somehow 10 days to assemble a delegation of lawyers is insufficient. It didn't fly.
Yes, and I think that was quite noticeable, just the caliber of the representatives from the Israeli side. And there seems to be a sense of resignation there, that all the major institutions, in their eyes, have failed Israel. I saw after the ICC issued its statement, a number of pro-Israeli commentators, this is not Israel itself, pro-Israeli commentators saying that the ICC is a neo-Nazi fascist institution. So everyone's an anti-Semite if you go after Israel. That's the level of rhetoric we are seeing at the ICJ in response to the ICC. And this resignation seems to have permeated all corners of support for Israel, whether it be in Tel Aviv or in Washington. Last week, Washington, well, we'll get to that, but Netanyahu in particular is facing a lot of criticism. There's a sense that, he has lost the war against Hamas, and there is a desperate attempt in Washington and in Tel Aviv to salvage the situation. And that's taken many forms. But let's start with Israel, with Benny Gantz saying that, addressing Prime Minister Netanyahu Saturday, that unless there is a plan for the governance of Gaza, he will leave or withdraw from the war cabinet. So that's a threat Gantz has issued to Netanyahu, and he wants this plan laid out by 8th of June. So it seems to be a lot of panic there, don't you think?
Yes, I mean the Israeli wartime leadership is transforming into a circular firing squad. We've spoken about this earlier. It's really a war of all against all, and all staking out a position for after this war ends and the next leadership has to be chosen. Um, and if one looks at the six demands made by Benny Gantz, it's really it stretches credulity. He's insisting that Netanyahu, who refuses to put forward any plan for an alternate administration in Gaza for reasons we can get into later, he's insisting that Netanyahu adopt a plan that would allow for an American, European, Arab, non-PA Palestinian administration to take over Gaza, as if that's in any way a realistic prospect. And even if you were to put together such a coalition, well, I have news for Benny Gantz. You have to defeat Hamas first. And as you mentioned, there's no indication of that happening anytime soon. Gantz is demanding that Israelis displaced from the northern border zone be returned there by the 1st of September, the beginning of the school year in Israel. And what he's really saying is that he's insisting that Netanyahu go to war against Hezbollah if there is no diplomatic resolution of that issue anytime soon. So the idea that he is somehow, a more sensible and pragmatic Israeli doesn't really hold much water. And the other thing I think we need to recall, Gantz has been a core member, together with his buddy Gadi Eisenkot, the author of the Dahya Doctrine. They've been core members of this war cabinet since October of last year, October or November. So the idea that all of a sudden they are no longer responsible for the strategic impasse in which Israel finds itself, again, is not going to fly very well in Israel or anywhere else, I would add. And the final point I would make is that Gantz and Eisenkot, they're members of the war cabinet, but they're not members of the governing coalition. So, of course, they have served as valuable camouflage and fig leaves for Netanyahu to present himself as a genuine national leader. But if he has to choose between these two characters, who don't add up to the parliamentary map of his parliamentary majority, or people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who do make it into his parliamentary calculations and with whom he is more closely ideologically aligned, it's very clear who he's going to ignore.
And in the US, there was a report last week that they are looking to help the Israelis track down Yahya Sinwar and assassinate him and declare total victory so it can bring an end to the war in Gaza. So it's not really so much Hamas, but it's to be one individual. And that, again, to me, is a sign of desperation. If we can simply find a way to kill this one individual, we can help the Israelis declare the victory, which seems to be impossible now.
Yes, well, the context of this is that according to these various media reports, the US offered to share highly sensitive intelligence with Israel about Yahya Sinwar's whereabouts in exchange for an Israeli commitment not to invade Rafah, which is something Israel has already done. And again, the idea that the United States possesses highly sensitive information about the whereabouts of Yahya Sinwar or any other senior Hamas leader in the Gaza Strip and has not already shared them with the Israelis is absolute nonsense. The reason the US hasn't shared this intelligence with Israel is because it doesn't have it. One source was quoted in one of the American newspapers, I forget which, saying that the last indication of Sinwar's whereabouts that US intelligence has is about a month old, which in practical terms makes it about as useful for locating Sinwar as does this conversation.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to now the trip by US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. So he met with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and also senior Israeli leaders. And let's start with Israel itself. And to me, when I saw the news from the meetings, it seems that Netanyahu has managed to call Biden's bluff. And Biden, let's remember last week, and well, for the last month, he said Rafah was a red line. He paused arms sales to Israel, but he managed to do nothing. Netanyahu still continued, pushed ahead, and invaded. Went into Rafah. And if you see the images, that's quite horrific to see how the whole region has been decimated and Palestinians have been cleared out altogether. Something like 800,000 Palestinians have cleared out from Rafah. So, do you think, I mean, the question is, I mean, has Netanyahu won that battle with Biden? Has he managed to call Biden's bluff and get his way, so to speak? Because from discussions I read between Sullivan and Israeli officials, he basically went in there and supported the Israelis in the Rafah operation. There wasn't any threats or warnings that one had seen 2 weeks ago over the past month or so.
Yes, I mean, well, first of all, just on the subject of suspension of arms, it wasn't the suspension of arms sales. It was the delayed delivery of one particular consignment of 2,000-pound bombs. The rest of the arms have been overflowing, and while the U.S. was consumed with this outrage of denying Israel a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to flatten Rafah, another $1 billion worth of arms went through to Israel. As far as Sullivan is concerned, yes, there is a faction in the U.S. leadership consisting of Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, and McGurk, for whom Israel can do no wrong, and Israel needs to be supported to the hilt. These are people who are thoroughly and completely invested in Israel's agenda. And I think Sullivan went there with an agenda of, again, as we were speaking about previously, hammering out the day after scenario with the Israelis, apparently a little too dense to realize that Israel has no intention of adopting a day after plan. Israel's day after plan is precisely the chaos that it has created in the Gaza Strip. And its day after plan is to perpetuate that chaos until it can either push the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip or make conditions of life so miserable that they begin to leave. That is a day after plan. And the US believing that it can persuade Israel to accept some kind of American, European, Arab, Palestinian coalition is a complete illusion and delusion.
And I think that's a point. That's a really important point, which many in the West seem incapable of grasping. That what we're seeing is not chaos and mayhem that is unplanned. This is really part of the plan. This is part of the strategy to make Gaza uninhabitable, and ethnic cleansing is still part of the agenda. I know there's a floating pier, and as far as I can see, that will in the future could be part of a plan to ship Palestinians out of Gaza. Who knows? But Israel is playing the long game, and that is the destruction we see, and the lack of planning is the plan itself. And I think many in the West fail to. Yeah. And going back to Jake Sullivan's visit, of course, he went to Riyadh and met with Mohammed bin Salman. And on top of the agenda there is the normalization with Israel and the security guarantees that or bilateral relationships between Riyadh and Washington. And there's talks of a semi-final version of a strategic agreement between the two countries, which are almost finalized. What do we know about the details of this so-called semi-final version between Riyadh and Washington? And can there be a semi-final version without Israel being part of this three-way deal? Saudi at the moment, all the message has been that they will not normalize ties as long as there's a genocide going on. But it seems like Washington is pushing ahead, and I don't understand what this final version could be or semi-final version could be.
Well, I mean, poor Jake Sullivan is in over his head and absolutely out of his depth. What has happened is that the Saudis have understood that this Israeli government is not going to make even cosmetic gestures towards the Palestinians, let alone lay out a credible pathway to an end to occupation and establishment of a Palestinian state. So the Saudis went to the Americans and they said, okay, let's leave Israel out of the equation and let's finalize the Saudi-American bilateral component of this deal, which would involve a formal American security guarantee to Saudi Arabia and U.S. delivery of a civilian nuclear program to Saudi Arabia, and this would be attractive to the US because it would also include Saudi guarantees to, for example, continue pricing oil in dollars and limit Chinese access to the Saudi markets and so on. But again, being completely invested in Israel's agenda, the response from Washington was that there is no bilateral US-Saudi agreement to be made, and that these aspects will only be concluded as part of a as part of a comprehensive deal that would also include Saudi-Israeli normalization, to which the Saudis have said, fine, then come up with a credible plan towards an end to occupation in a Palestinian state that Israel has explicitly endorsed. That plan, of course, does not exist. So to say that this is almost finalized is true in the sense that if you build a house without a roof, you've almost completed building it.
Yes, this is a good metaphor, which means we don't really have a house. Let's end with this sad news, which is the death of Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi, along with Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian. Internally, what does that do for Iran? And externally, does Iran's posture change towards Israel and the region and globally to the US? How do you read this politically and domestically? I mean, internationally and domestically.
Well, I think it's domestically significant in the sense that Iran is now also, let's say, into the process of succession from Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who's 85 years old and is not expected to live another 85 years. So there is already, I think, pre-positioning, let's say, for the day after Khamenei. And now Raisi's removal from the scene, and he was said to have been one of the contenders for that position, complicates matters. Having said that, Raisi was the president, but in the Iranian political system, supreme authority rests not with the president, but with the supreme leader. And Iran also has a network of institutions to govern and administer the country and to try to keep the regime stable. So it's not one of these situations where you have kind of an autocrat who enjoys absolute power over an entire country and system, and whose removal therefore throws it entirely into chaos. So it does not appear that his departure from the scene in and of itself is going to lead to a political crisis or a succession crisis. In terms of foreign policy, most observers expect very little change there, particularly as far as regional affairs are concerned. And this comports with what we've seen in previous presidential transitions. We've had pragmatists, hardliners, centrists ascending to the Iranian presidency over the past 2 decades. And we've seen, I think, fairly little change in Iran's regional posture and regional policies. I should add that there's may well be seeing something similar in Saudi Arabia, where King Salman is said to be very seriously ill. And here again, we have a case of an individual who is the titular leader of his country, but in which supreme authority actually rests not with him, or supreme power rather, not with him, but with his son, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So we may well also be seeing a transition in Saudi Arabia in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Moin. That was my guest, Moin Robani. And thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of Momo's Weekly Review with me, Naseem Ahmed. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.